In the summer of 1942, 35 merchant ships sailed into the Arctic carrying enough tanks, aircraft, and ammunition to arm an entire Soviet army. Within 72 hours, 24 of those ships were sitting on the ocean floor. The men who survived floated in water cold enough to kill a human being in under 4 minutes. And the most devastating part? They weren't destroyed by a superior enemy force. They were abandoned by their own admiralty. This is the story of convoy PQ-17, the most catastrophic Allied convoy disaster of the entire Second World War, and how its wreckage was finally found resting in the silence of the Arctic deep, decades after the world had moved on. To understand why PQ-17 matters, you have to understand what the Arctic convoys were. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Britain and America began sending war supplies to the Soviets by sea. The shortest route ran from Iceland, north around Nazi-occupied Norway, and into the Russian ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. It was one of the most dangerous voyages in maritime history. The convoys sailed through freezing fog, past German U-boat wolf packs within range of Luftwaffe bombers stationed in Norway, and under the constant threat of the most feared warship afloat, the battleship Tirpitz. Winston Churchill himself called it the worst journey in the world. By the spring of 1942, the convoys had already suffered serious losses, but the Allies kept pushing. Stalin demanded more supplies, Roosevelt agreed, and so in late June, convoy PQ-17 assembled in the cold waters off Iceland. It was one of the largest Arctic convoys ever organized. 35 merchant vessels loaded with nearly 200,000 tons of cargo, including almost 300 aircraft, 600 tanks, and thousands of trucks and ammunition crates. The sheer scale of what was being transported could have shifted the balance on the Eastern Front. Protecting this treasure fleet was a formidable escort. Close escort destroyers and corvettes sailed alongside the merchants. A cruiser covering force trailed behind. And further south, a distant covering force including the battleship HMS Duke of York and the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious stood ready to intercept the Tirpitz if she emerged from her Norwegian fjord. On paper, PQ-17 was one of the most heavily defended convoys of the war. But paper doesn't account for fear. The convoy departed on the 27th of June, 1942. For the first few days, the passage was tense but manageable. The ships pushed through thick Arctic fog, which ironically provided natural cover from German reconnaissance aircraft. But by the 2nd of July, the fog lifted. German Focke-Wulf condors spotted the convoy and began shadowing it. The U-boats moved in. Luftwaffe torpedo bombers launched their first strikes, sinking 3 ships on the 4th of July. It was violent, but it was expected. Convoys took losses. That was the grim arithmetic of war. What was not expected was the order that came next. On the evening of the 4th of July, 1942, the First Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound, made a decision that would haunt the Royal Navy for decades. Based on intelligence reports suggesting that the Tirpitz and other heavy German warships had left their Norwegian bases, Pound issued a series of signals that would become infamous. The first ordered the cruiser force to withdraw westward at high speed. The second, just minutes later, delivered the words that sealed the convoy's fate. It read, "Convoy is to scatter." Those 4 words were a death sentence. To scatter a convoy was the most desperate measure in the Royal Navy's playbook. It meant every ship for itself. No formation, no mutual defense, no escort protection. The merchant ships, many of them slow and lightly armed, were suddenly alone in the Arctic Ocean, surrounded by U-boats and within the range of hundreds of German aircraft. The escorts peeled away. The merchants scattered in every direction, each captain left to decide his own course through the ice and the enemy. And then the killing began. Over the next several days, German submarines and aircraft hunted the scattered merchantmen across hundreds of miles of open sea. The attacks were relentless and methodical. Ship after ship was found, torpedoed, or bombed. The SS Carleton was sunk by a U-boat on the 5th of July. The Hanamu went down the same day. The Pancraft, the Washington, the Bolton Castle, the Paulus Potter. One by one, the names accumulated on the casualty list like a roll call of the dead. Some ships tried to hide in fog banks or along the edge of the pack ice. A few made desperate runs toward the Russian coast. Others simply stopped, their crews calculating that sitting motionless might make them harder to spot than leaving a visible wake. For the men aboard these ships, every hour was a gamble between movement and stillness, between being found and being frozen. The crews that abandoned ship faced an enemy just as deadly as any torpedo. The Arctic water was barely above freezing. A man in a life jacket had minutes before hypothermia set in. Those who made it into lifeboats drifted for days through fields of sea ice, rationing food and water, watching for rescue that often never came. Some lifeboats reached the desolate shores of Novaya Zemlya, a remote Russian archipelago where survivors huddled in makeshift shelters, burning wreckage for warmth. Others were picked up by Soviet or Allied vessels days later, frostbitten, starving, and haunted by what they had witnessed. When the final tally was counted, it was devastating. 24 of 35 merchant ships had been sunk. 153 merchant mariners were dead. Along with the men, the Arctic swallowed nearly 100,000 tons of cargo, including 210 aircraft, 430 tanks, 3,600 vehicles, and enough ammunition, food, and medical supplies to equip an entire division. It was the single greatest loss suffered by any Allied convoy in the entire war. And here's the bitter truth that made PQ-17 a scandal rather than simply a tragedy. The Tirpitz never attacked. The German surface fleet that Admiral Pound feared so deeply had barely moved. The battleship sortied briefly and then turned back, recalled by Hitler, who was wary of risking his capital ships. The convoy had been scattered for a phantom threat. The greatest loss in convoy history was triggered by an order based on a danger that never materialized. The aftermath was poisonous. The surviving merchant crews were furious. The Royal Navy was humiliated. Relations between the Allied navies were strained. Stalin accused Churchill of cowardice for subsequently suspending the Arctic convoys. The blame fell largely on Admiral Pound, who was already gravely ill and would die of a brain tumor just over a year later. But whether Pound acted on faulty intelligence or out of personal panic has been debated by historians for more than 80 years. For decades after the war, the wrecks of PQ-17 lay undisturbed on the floor of the Barents Sea, scattered across a vast area of the Arctic at depths ranging from 60 to 300 meters. They became ghost ships, entombed in water so cold that decomposition barely touched them. The merchant vessels that once carried the arsenal of democracy sat in darkness, their cargo holds still loaded with the tanks and aircraft they never delivered. If you're still with me on this journey, you clearly share a fascination with the forgotten corners of history. If you've learned something new today, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of this story hit you hardest. Was it the scatter order, the phantom threat, or something else entirely? Your engagement keeps stories like these alive, and it helps more people discover them. Now let me tell you about what happened when the world finally went back down to find what was lost. Starting in the late 1980s and accelerating through the 2000s, a series of expeditions began locating the wrecks of PQ-17 using side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles. What they found was both haunting and remarkably preserved. The cold, dark waters of the Arctic had acted as a natural museum. Ships that had burned and sunk in 1942 still sat largely intact on the seabed, their hulls encrusted with marine growth, but their structures recognizable. One of the most striking discoveries was the wreck of the SS Alcoa Ranger, an American cargo vessel found resting upright on the ocean floor. Her cargo hatches were still visible, and the outline of vehicles in her holds could be detected through sonar imaging. Nearby, other wrecks told similar stories: the Peter Kerr, the Fairfield City, the John Witherspoon. Each wreck was a time capsule, frozen in the moment of its destruction. But the discoveries were not just archaeological, they were deeply personal. For the families of the men who died aboard these ships, the location of the wrecks provided something that decades of silence never could: a place to direct their grief. Some families traveled to the approximate locations and held private memorial services, dropping wreaths into the Arctic waters above the remains of their fathers and grandfathers. The Russian government designated several of the wreck sites as war graves, granting them legal protection from salvage operations. The British and Norwegian governments followed with similar measures. In doing so, they acknowledged something that the chaos of wartime had not allowed for. These ships and the men who sailed them deserve to be remembered, not as statistics in a strategic failure, but as individuals who gave everything in a cause larger than themselves. In 2020, a comprehensive survey using advanced autonomous underwater vehicles mapped more of the PQ-17 debris field than ever before. The images that came back were startling in their clarity: tank turrets visible through collapsed deck plating, aircraft wings folded at unnatural angles inside flooded cargo bays. The personal effects of crew members scattered across the seabed. Each image was a reminder that this was not simply a military operation. It was a human catastrophe. And perhaps that is the most important thing PQ-17 teaches us, even now, more than 80 years later. The scatter order was not given by a villain. It was given by a man operating under immense pressure, with incomplete information, facing an impossible choice. The merchant sailors who died were not soldiers. They were civilians, volunteers, many of them, who sailed into the most dangerous waters on Earth because the cargo they carried might save millions of lives on the Eastern Front. The wrecks of PQ-17 do not lie on the Arctic floor as monuments to failure. They lie there as proof of what ordinary people were willing to risk when the world itself was at stake. 24 ships, 153 lives, an ocean of courage, sitting in the cold and the dark, waiting for someone to remember. And now you have